Okay, so a warm welcome to all viewers and participants of this plenary session entitled Not Quite the End of Nomadism. My name is Anthony Howarth. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Oxford. I have a long-term interest in groups with a tradition of mobility and the broader socio-political conditions in which they live. I will also be convening today's roundtable, the aim of which is to bring together scholars whose work is focused on groups categorized as nomads, and to explore whether and in what ways the nomad category remains analytically tenable, and to shed light on why it endures. Regarding the session's background, I invited 9 scholars to take part in this discussion, and I thank them all for their time and participation. They are David Sneath from the University of Cambridge, Dawn Chatty from the University of Oxford, Thomas Barfield from the University of Boston, Freya Hope from the University of Oxford, no Oxford bias here, Jaakko Heiskainen, University of Cambridge, Ariel O'Hearn, University of Oxford, Marco Solomini, University of Iceland, Greta Semplici, European University Institute, and Corey Rogers, the University of Oxford. So in order to promote dialogue, the format will be an open discussion rather than separate presentations among participants who will respond to a number of set questions. Right, okay. And oh yes, and before we begin, I'd like to thank the conference organizers, all participants and audience for all of their hard work in bringing this conference and panel to fruition. It's an absolute pleasure to be at the Congress, although it's unfortunate that we can't enjoy the Adriatic coast. So without further ado, the overarching question that the panel seeks to respond to is the nomadic category analytically tenable? If so, or not, how? So rather than all of us kind of jumping in on this question straight away, I thought it best to explore the sub-questions first, because they kind of feed into this, and then in the conclusion, we can come back and decide whether or not it is actually or isn't actually analytically tenable. Without further ado, the first sub-question is, do the ways the nomadic category is popularly imagined, politically deployed, and historically documented make it an empirical ethnographic object worthy of analysis? Again, to keep the responses focused, I've broken this question down into kind of 3 parts because it's quite a complicated question. So firstly, this is the first question for respondents. Do the ways the nomad category is popularly imagined make it an ethnographic object worthy of analysis? So it's open to responses now. Anybody?
Well, I'll start out, having written a textbook on nomadism. I think one of the problems that it's worth reinvestigating this at least every 20 or 30 years, because the questions are perennial. But I think one of the problems comes up that for me, when I say nomad, I mean pastoral nomad, but they are actually, nomadic involves mobility, and pastoralism is a type of economy. In most people's minds, pastoralists are nomads, but foraging peoples, are mobile. So are peripatetic people. And I think one of the problems is if we try to lump everything in on mobility without immediately saying mobility can be used in a variety of ways that are quite different from one another, that we have a problem. So I think one of the difficulties is simply that when you say nomad as a category, it's a partial category. And I think that leads to a lot of confusion right at the beginning. I think once we sort it out in the various categories, then it's useful. But when it stands on its own, I think, particularly in the popular mind, it is often, it's either too broad or not broad enough.
So anybody else? Would anyone else like to respond to the question or to what Tom had to say?
I saw Dawn and Freya had their hand up before Thomas Barfield. So just to point out that they had their hands in the queue.
Yeah,
Okay.
if I could come in here, because I think I can probably carry on with some of the ideas that Tom has just put forward. I'm just going to give you a little bit of history. I've been working with pastoralists, I'm saying that carefully, for the last 50 years. And when I first began, of course, Philip Saltzman, John Galati, that whole group were just forming the Commission on Nomadic Peoples. And at the time, the term that was used was pastoral nomads. So nomads was the noun. But I always had trouble with that because the pastoralist was a description of the noun, which was basically about moving around, the use of space. And so throughout the 1980s, I kind of very gently tried to turn it all around and talk about nomadic pastoralists, to make pastoralists really what we were looking at. But that got me into a lot of trouble in the region I work in, which is the Middle East, because in this region, the colonial legacy has been such that the categories that are created and that have been legislated in law with different rights to nomads, semi-nomads, semi-settled, and settled nomads. And this I found really difficult because what it was all about was the way that the governments and later on international development organizations were directing all of their attention at the last category, the settled nomads, because these were the people that were moving in the direction that talked about progress and modernization. So by the end of the 1980s, I dropped the term nomad and I began using mobile, because what I was really seeing in these herding communities was that many of them were adapting to residences, to homes, to houses near areas where governments had established services. But actually, they were either splitting their household or they were actually becoming much, much more mobile, moving around a great deal more because they had all adopted truck transport really from the 1970s. So I've stopped really using the term nomad, except when I'm giving a talk to a popular group, because nomad in our consciousness is kind of, it's a term, it's kind of romanticized sometimes, unless you're talking about service provider nomads, which means something different, or herding nomads and so on. So I think the term has really got to be examined again. I don't think analytically it's a very useful term any longer. So thank you.
So I think Freya was next, but I don't know whether or not she's put her hand down. Do you want to speak, Freya?
So the group that I'm studying actually are a newly formed group, and so in relation to how they're popularly imagined, that has actually really like impacted kind of how they formed as a group, because this kind of ideas that are normally considered in the literature as kind of the way that they're romanticized is kind of aspects of how they've taken on to form as a group, because they're a mobile group in the UK, new or new age travelers, and they kind of came out of the 60s like counterculture movement and ended up like making a mobile group that they wanted to kind of live in an alternative way, and they kind of took on some of those ideas about being like the free egalitarian nomad or free kind of spirit, or wandering, not necessarily for like economic purposes. So for my group, I do have to consider the way that it's popularly imagined, because that's kind of been some of the basis that they formed their group and kind of imagine themselves. So yeah.
Michael, you have your hand up? Yeah. David, go.
Yeah, okay. Well, because I didn't know what format Anthony had in mind, I actually put together some slides, just 10 slides, but I think I probably won't show those, no particular point. I mean, my own views are sort of guessable, I think, for those who have talked to me about this kind of thing before. I mean, I think the thing really is that, as Dawn pointed out, really sort of by the late 20th century, most specialists had dropped using nomad really and talked about mobile pastoralists. There are very good reasons for this. And, from the 80s, well, 70s really, but certainly from the 80s on, there was a lot of discussions in the literature as to why lumping together a whole set of different peoples with very different practices around just this question of mobility, because obviously the original is the Greek term nomos, which was actually to do with grazing. And then a lot of the classical literature, you see shepherd and nomad interchangeable. So it was clearly the archetype was a sort of grazing lifestyle, but it's come to mean just people who move around. And the problem is that snowball, as it rolled through history, has picked up an enormous amount of sort of misinformation, not just the sort of romantic images of fierce, free and wandering, but a whole set of more specific kinds of theories as to what type of society would be. So, you know, we've got the early evolutionist schemes have, you know, savagery giving way to barbarism, giving way to civilization. And later they were transformed into hunter-gatherers that were the savages, nomads who were the barbarians, and then the civilized group again. And so, you know, all the classical literature has nomadism as a stage of barbarism. Engels describes this as a sort of stage of barbarism that got stuck. And indeed, if you look at Toynbee, who very influential world historian, you know, it's an arrested, nomadism is an arrested civilization. It's got stuck somewhere along the lines. The point is, with all this kind of conceptual baggage, by the time people come to study real places with real people in them, all the associations of a term nomad are really unhelpful. They're generally misleading. And indeed, the category itself, you find a complete diversity of people who employ some mobility. So, you know, people may move a little, transhumans, they may move a lot, they may be migrants, they may be going on boats, all sorts of people. People use mobility for lots of different reasons, including ranchers and long distance truck drivers and all sorts of things. And when you look at the sort of classic home, as it were, of pastoral nomadism, which is, there are 2 or 3 kind of prime candidates. One is sort of Middle Eastern area that Dawn is concerned with. Thomas Barfield and I both concerned with Inner Asia. Well, in these regions, you know, you don't see a kind of separate, isolated sort of subsistence strategy with a lot of random movement. All the evidence suggests really focused use of mobility, often within bigger political economies that may well be based on the steppe and often incorporated agriculture and all the things that, to the Victorian mindset, that had sort of filtered out a kind of separate stage of human development, a kind of hunter-gatherer stage. They didn't really understand very much. They were just hunting and getting food, and then nomadism, they were wandering around, not knowing where to go to next. All actually ridiculous. The real societies that we've got contemporary accounts of or historical accounts of, mobility is employed as a particular purpose to do something. In some cases, with some species of livestock, a lot of movement, but almost always with very particular kinds of pastures, and other species often rather little movement. And often within a, say, an ecclesiastical or a princely domain, which much of the steppe was ruled in terms of, at least as far as the good histories, the histories where we get good details of, we get quite complex patterns which include agriculture, because some of the people are tasked by their masters to grow, say, classically millet, which they might sow, move away from, leaving some people to look after them. These are feudal obligations or quasi-feudal obligations on commoner subjects by aristocrats, and then later move back again. So we really have enough evidence now to completely reject most of the 19th and early 20th century theorization, which was all sort of from first principles. Well, if you don't have a home and you're moving around a lot, we can guess all these things about the society. All pretty much misleading. And what we're left with is this sort of bizarre category, which is just sort of people who move. Well, you could sort of say, oh, it's still a useful category. You know, we can qualify it. We can sort of explain people who move for this particular reason. And that's a fair enough argument. There are lots of other categories you might want to do the same with. Idolaters. Idolaters, there's nothing wrong with that. It's people who worship idols. It's just not very useful because the differences of different people's use of idols in different ritual practices are so enormous that trying to create kind of theories with respect to idolaters is pretty hopeless. And it's also got all this unhelpful conceptual baggage, all the normativity of the great book religions looking down on ones they consider to be pagan or heathen or whatever it is. So idolaters really still perfectly useful as a word because it crops up. You know, it may be used in administration or the commentaries about different people. So it's a perfectly good word, and we shouldn't reject the term idolaters, but to use it as an analytical category that we think is a useful category within which we can make general comments about the nature of idolaters is kind of a bit ridiculous. And I think the same really is true of nomads as the term has currently come to be understood. Obviously, the original kind of early, say, English and French uses of it are much closer to nomad, to mobile pastoralism, and that's a different kind of matter. But now, as we say, everything from New Age nomad to travelers to people living in boats, all these people are supposed to share something. Well, you know, we all share the ability to move. And if you look at the Mongolian language, you know, home of nomadism, the term for nomad, Noodlechin, is actually, it means to move. So there's nothing like a sort of indigenous term that matches this idea of nomad. The term for people herding livestock is malchin, people with animals. It's not defined by movement, it's defined by looking after livestock. And where you have to move a lot to look after livestock, you do. And if you don't have to move much, you don't. So defining it in terms of this thing, this sort of exotic feature which caught the eye of early European commentators is really, I think, now become quite unhelpful.
Marco?
Yes. So I try to connect to this, the former comments, because I think that you're saying things that are very much important, and they appeared also, at least in the panel that I was listening to about the reflecting on nomadism, and there is this question of the circumstance, the importance of the contextualization of the usage of a category, okay? And but I think that if we go back to the idea of can we use the popular category of nomadism as an ethnographic category, I think that actually there is a lot that we might use the moment in which we go back to the circumstance, because all this conceptual baggage that is used in order to define who the nomads are or not, and is often exoticizing and so on. This kind of baggage is also telling us very much about the society which produces these categories. So if we drop the perspective from those who are observed to those who are observing and creating this category, then I think that is very interesting, and we can still use this category in a local level, of course, and trying to also find the enmeshments of popular imageries with, as you were saying already, Don was talking about this, the language of power, which are enmeshed and intertwined, but they are not coinciding at the same time. And then, of course, there is also the language of academics. So, yes, in this term, probably I think that it is still possible to use, at least for the popular, as a popular category, it can be useful to think about nomadism. But with that, yeah.
Can I come quickly back on that? I mean, I'm just quite agreeing with Marco. As a genre, it's really useful and very revealing. I mean, Orientalism used to be a real subject. People used to really study Orientalism. I'm an Orientalist. I'm proud of it. Now it refers to a genre of literature, and it's still very useful. In fact, it's become kind of more useful because we're aware of someone who described this as a genre. And so as a genre category, it can be very helpful, I think, for intellectual consideration.
I'm so excited about this discussion, by the way. So wonderful to see colleagues and former dissertation supervisors and examiners. Anyway, I just want to jump in to say, going back to this point about when the word nomad enters into legal frameworks, because I think there's an issue as well around, although it may not be very helpful academically, what happens when we talk about marginalization of, people who are marginalized because they move, because they are pastoralists, or, Roma, or, similar groups, then, how do we deal with it from a human rights perspective? We have this idea of indigenous people, which also includes a great variety of groups that don't necessarily, if you look at each group, they're quite different from each other. Just like if you look at all the groups of people that, were written about in the Journal of Nomadic Peoples, you also find huge variety, but yet I think there's something there around how to fight for human rights for people who are disadvantaged, and often land is grabbed from them. They're invisibilized. Even within academia, they're marginalized. So it's just wondering how this plays out when we think about, human rights and actually advocacy work related to it that we as academics obviously participate in.
I see that Jaakko had his hand up. I just want to ask him, Jaakko, do you still have a question?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't actually find the hand up function, but I just wanted to sort of jump in on what David and Marco were saying, which is kind of about this baggage that the nomad concept has accumulated over time. I mean, I should say as a caveat that I'm not an anthropologist by training and I don't use ethnographic methods. There's no specific group of nomads that I study. My work is instead trying to construct the history of the concept. So I'm looking at the concept of the nomad rather than any particular group of what might be called nomadic people. And what interests me in this kind of the very varied connotations that the concept has accumulated is the kind of splitting of the concept in two directions. So David already mentioned this association of the nomad concept with sort of in some way primitive, barbaric or stagnant societies. But what seems to be happening at the same time from the mid-19th century onward is the use of the term nomad in a more metaphorical sense to designate kind of the excesses of capitalism or modernity. So it starts with kind of development of railways and new methods of travel, that you have this creation of nomads as kind of representing not just the past, but also a future in a way. And this can take both negative and positive forms. So in the mid-20th century, early 20th century anti-Semitic discourse, you can find references to Semitic nomads that are seen to represent the excesses of capitalism and modernity. They move around ruthlessly, sapping the strength and wealth of the nation. And then also the more sort of utopian idea of the nomad as representing a borderless future. So the nomad is not only kind of pre-modern, but also in a way acquires this postmodern connotation. And I think that's another fact that makes it a very interesting category to analyze, but problematic if you think it refers to any very clear empirical reality. Yeah, thanks.
Cheers. Greta?
Yeah, I think it's connected a little bit also with what Jaakko was saying, but mainly Idel's point on human rights, which raised this thought based on the panel that we hosted the other day on the representations of the nomad, but which was kind of, so there is a point of criticism with the abandonment of the nomadology or nomadic category about the depoliticization of pastoralism, which was very present when this was analyzed through the nomadic category. But then in our panel, I guess we raised the point that also the nomadic category is hiding certain power relations and in a way also providing, to a certain extent, reproducing an exoticized image of the nomad as outside history. While not only nomadic group are, in the successful cases, they are very central to process of transformations, but often they're also marginalized because they don't have the access to resources or the skills to participate in local politics and in the partition of resources. So linked also to the more legal and human rights dimension that perhaps Ariel was mentioning. So I think there is a very thin line that we are working on when we politicize or not a category. And maybe this point that Jaakko was now raising, that is not like breaking the idea that nomadology is linked to a pre-modern society, but breaking it up to include also how the nomadic spaces are now broader than what is used to be defined in the nomadology literature, can help make it useful again, but then I'm not entirely sure. I haven't used it in my work. In the end, I use mobility or mobile people as the analytical category because I was kind of afraid of using the big concept there for the loaded heritage that comes with.
Yeah, I think loaded heritage is a good term. Corey?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I think I generally have agreed with pretty much everything that everyone said so far. So I think there's quite a bit of consensus here in a way. I think if I were to maybe just add one more proposition, and this would be specifically in regard to this question of whether the idea of nomadism is analytically tenable. So kind of putting aside the fact that it often in popular discourse is shaped by a lot of the baggage that it brings with it. One of the things that I've found, my work was, like Greta, was in Turkana in northwestern Kenya. And this is a place where often the word nomad is applied. In my own work, I didn't actually use it. And the reason was that it seemed very clear to me that as far as nomad is used to group together different societies, it was not a very useful term. So this would sort of be the cross-cultural dimension of or application of the word nomad. What I did find it useful for to some degree, and what I think a lot of people in Turkana found it useful for, was describing social differentiation within that one particular place. And I guess I would be interested in hearing if this is also the case with other people's work. So in the case of Turkana, a lot of people who live in town use the word nomad to describe people who had a different commitment to the idea of living in one place, and specifically usually in an urban place. These were people who were willing to leave that place, collapse their house, and build another structure somewhere else. It's still problematic. It still brought with it a lot of other baggage about this group being backward, but there was something analytically useful about that, and that it came up quite a lot in regard to local development policies, ideas of urban development, and even there's a refugee camp in Turkana. So in regard to sort of the different elements of the host community in that refugee camp, it was a useful way of addressing social differentiation. So that would maybe be another proposition I would put out to the group.
Tom?
I think one of the problems is which audience you have. I mean, if you're dealing with development projects or specialists, if they use the term nomad, you almost have to deal with them on their basis, particularly if they're writing it into law. And one of the most difficult things is, it was particularly true in Afghanistan, was that we need to settle these people in order to improve their livelihood, when in fact they were richer than the peasants that were around, and their wealth was in livestock. And there's a state bias to that. A sedentary bias that the only kind of land rights are ones when you're sitting on it and not moving. And there, I think, discussing people who do not identify themselves by a place, but as a network. So the whole group can move from one place to another. They're still the same group. They just moved elsewhere. And is also a problem for sedentary states of any type. Do not like people that move for any reason. It's just bad for bureaucracy. So in some cases, there's just simply an argument in terms of using these terms about dealing with their real life consequences. And so sometimes pushing back against stereotypes, which may have disappeared in academia, but it's sort of at the peril of people that we work with if we don't realize that an idea that we dismiss actually has real world consequences. This is one of the things, if we talk about race, anthropologists say race doesn't exist. Doesn't mean that people believing in that concept can't do immense amounts of damage with that it's not going to help if we say it doesn't exist, case over. But going back to some of the things that David raised, we forget, I think sometimes when we're talking about definition, we focus on today's world, 20th century, 21st century, and have to realize that these concepts also have value in explaining the past. And in the past, pastoral nomads, particularly in parts of Eurasia, were not marginal people. They were pure polities, like with China. Or in the Middle East, they found dynasties. Ibn Khaldun writes a lot about that. Or in Iran, you had these huge nomadic confederacies that were really that played games with the state in which it wasn't clear, is the state dominant or is the Qashqai confederacy dominant? And today the state has won. And I think we forget that in the past, a lot of the views to nomads were not so much that they were necessarily inferior, but they were very dangerous. This is where sort of if you go back to the barbarian trope is, so how can the barbarians win? That's a tough question. If you're, which is one that Ibn Khaldun took up, if you're in a sedentary area, why are your rulers coming from nomadic origin, and what baggage does that bring with them? And how do they socialize over time? So these are kind of things, one of the things I think we shouldn't forget is that it's not, the concept is not just ethnographic, but also is a concept that's necessary to understand, power relations over the past couple millennia that we shouldn't ignore.
Right. So I'm going to kind of push it on this because I think there can be some other reactions from a European context. So, so what about how it's politically deployed? I mean, we have touched on this, right? But I think there's people here who can extend this. Does this make the nomad category an ethnographic object worthy of analysis?
So, and again, it goes back to the fact that, and I want to just make a connection to what Thomas was saying, because actually it brings in the question of also the political consequences, very practical political consequences of this category. I think that what was interesting from Thomas was also he was highlighting the fact that we usually have this kind of very binary opposition of nomadism and sedentarism. Or at least this is what often appears in many languages. So the language of power is like this, in collective imagery. Also academians, sometimes we have been trying now to create this divide between nomadism and sedentary. But then what Thomas was saying is that how much the nomads have been integral parts of this sedentary society as well, no? And this brings me to the idea, for example, my field of studies, which are the so-called gypsies, or also Roman nomads. And here I think we have exactly the same debate about which is the term which should be correctly used in order to refer to these persons. Is it gypsies? Is it nomads? Is it Romanis? And I see a lot of similarities between the question of how do we use nomadism or not? Is it adequate or not? And the concept of Roma. But the point is that usually gypsies or the Roma, they are considered somehow something external, external. And I think that's one of the most interesting elements of reflection that was brought first of. I mean, one of the first was Judith Oakley talking about this, was the fact that she was saying, no, that the gypsies, the traveler gypsies in England are not something, an exogenous community that did not come from the outside, but they are the exact products of capitalist society and of modern society first. So my point is that often we think as this kind of there is this what Anselm was calling the discontinuous sin, in which we really create very separate categories and separate social units. When instead, when we look at nomads, we understand people who are categorized as nomads. I think we have to look also at what brings them together. And what brings them together through the so-called majority society that is creating instead a divide with them. Today, I think that thinking about how, for example, the governmentality, discourses of governmentality are deploying this category of nomads in order are deploying this category that can be very useful to understand how the discourse of power is being applied not only to those who are considering themselves as nomads, but also to as a larger category, which speaks also to what the question concerning citizenship and so on. Sorry, I lost a little bit my stream of thoughts. And then it became a little bit obscure what I was trying to say. So what I was saying, yes, I think that it's very interesting it is in a discourse when nomadism becomes an object of analysis and of research of how the state and the language of power is creating and is creating subjects. So the questions of subjectification and objectification by the language of power, then again, I think that nomadism is very interesting. But then again, here we have also to see the measurements, and here connects also to what Greta was saying, between what is the language of power of the state, for example, at least for the Roma, and also how this is hijacked and incorporated by those who are categorized, for example, as nomads, who are not always rejecting this category, but sometimes using it in I was seeing here strategic essentialism in the comments, or what you might also call inverted Orientalism. Abu Lugal was talking about that, where actually sometimes it can become also a political weapon at the same time. So I think that this brings to the interesting part is the enmeshment of these categories between the discourses of power from above and those from below, and how they are not opposing to each other completely, but there is rather an intersection of them.
Okay. David?
I just want to agree and come back to a point that Jarkko made earlier about the incorporation of the term, the concept, into a lot of European intellectual work right through the 20th century. A really good example of what he was mentioning, which was to sort of pose in some ways in a positive ways, but occasionally with the anti-Semitism in a negative way, the nomad category, as opposed to or outside, or indeed, as Thomas was saying, challenging to the state. A really good example of that is Deleuze and Guattari, who of course become terribly popular in social science. And they write, "It is true that the nomads have no history, only a geography." And I mean, that's patent nonsense. I mean, there's lots and lots of history. Writing was common right across the area that's best known for nomads since the 5th century, at least. And we can find it now. Archaeology is turning up more and more evidence of this, and agriculture and concentrations, urban settlements, and all sorts of things that completely churn up and it sort of, you know, destabilize any of these old Victorian kind of from first principles imaginations as to what sort of society must be like if you were always on the move. But I was also going to agree with Thomas. I mean, the thing is, it's out there. It's a real big category, and real powerful effects happen from the use by governments and others by this category. And a good example of Deleuze and Guattari, you know, I mean, they're just intellectuals, but they call, what do they call their project? They called it nomadology. It was supposed to be an anti-state science. I mean, a hopeless idea, I think, in every way, but it shows the continuing purchase, right down, I'm going to get trendy again. So the continuing purchase of the essentialized kind of imagination of the nomad, that in other sorts of thought. And I think the gap between that and any real place where people may or may not herd animals and may or may not use some mobility, the gap between those things, I think, just gets bigger and bigger.
So we have some questions from the audience, but I'm going to leave these until the end. So it's Greta now.
Yeah, it's linking with what David was also saying. I guess that politically, my point is where the nomadism as a category is used, even within it, because there are the philosophical exercises in nomadology and nomadism, but then there is also ethnographic cases which perhaps are used kind of strategically also beyond ethnography as such, to And the problem is when this is politicized in a way of evasion, autonomy, isolation, remoteness, for which we are not finding great evidence. I suppose there is a lot of interconnectedness, a lot of exchange, a lot of interactions. So what I would find more useful is focusing on this point of interconnection to reveal the power relations which are at stake, and the objective should be changing, removing the power asymmetry. But if using a nomadic category hides, end up hiding this power asymmetries, then it's not useful, it's even misleading. But then connecting with the anchor point, if instead nomadism is not only taken to discuss some old societies, but also in a future direction, then maybe there is some political potential as well. It depends what we're really talking about. And power relations would be the point of the category of analysis.
I'm gonna move on to the next question now, because we've covered that in a lot of detail. So if, as some scholars suggest, nomadism is a category imagined by outsiders, is its academic use appropriate? Maybe it isn't a category imagined by outsiders.
I mean, I can briefly say my view, which is that I don't think there's anything inherently problematic with categories imagined by outsiders. I think they can actually be really valuable in generating the possibilities of comparison across space and time. I think it's valuable for theory building. So I wouldn't say the outsider perspective in itself is problematic. It kind of just depends on what kind of project that it's implicated in. What are the political implications of that imaginary? And I think then that leads to everything that we've just discussed about all the problematic associations and the sort of over flexibility of the concept. And that's what's problematic in my view, more than just the fact that it's externally imagined, if indeed it is.
Yeah, shoot.
Well, okay. I'm really keen to hear what Claire Oxby has to say, though. You know, she's a pioneer of the study of sort of mobile pastoralism in Africa. So, I mean, I'm really keen to find out what she has to say. I was just quickly responding to that point. Yes, I mean, I think the outsiders, insiders, the world is so permeable. Within a very short space of time, often much less than a generation, categories move around. And so people on the inside of some category will be picking up and making use of concepts if they know they're powerful. So there's the same story in lots of categories. You know, tribe, another imagined outsider term, but enormously powerful in a lot of colonial states and post-colonial states, where they've become, it's generated administrative reality. Now, we anthropologists have pretty much dropped tribe as an analytical term for all its internal problems, but it doesn't stop it being a real feature of languages of power and languages used by everybody in lots of contexts. So, no, I mean, as I mentioned with the Mongol case, there is an internal term, and it has been made to look a little bit like the external one, because, you know, Nudlin Soyos Irgenshith has been, with Nudlach as the core term, has been forced into the mold of nomadic civilization. But the actual core term, Nuch, and therefore noodle, to move, just doesn't mean what it means. It isn't the same as nomadism. It's an aberration. It's not what Malchid, that is livestock herders, do routinely and continuously. So it's become, so a sort of nomadism is now in a kind of completely insiders Mongol term, if you use noodlechid for nomads, but it is a result of an external, very particular kind of intellectual history that via mostly Russia, Mongolia has now become thoroughly familiar with.
Okay. Tom?
In my own work in Afghanistan, actually the pastoralists that I worked with, they used to live in yurts, then they own land. They use portable dwellings in the summer and spring, but not in the winter. There's two terms. The one that they preferred was mal dar, mal meaning animal wealth. They said that's what we are. We're people that have animal wealth. We also move. But the normal name within Afghanistan for people who move was Kuchi, which literally means kuch, to move. And the people that I was with took that as a bit of a pejorative because there were plenty of poor people that moved. They weren't so poor. So they, and the biggest distinction they made, again, this was pastoralist, amongst themselves was people who had bought land, people who weren't concerned so much with their animals. They said, these people are not Maldars anymore, you know, because I remember one saying, he puts his land first. So he's not part of us anymore. So it turns out that these categories are actually, I would say, at least in Afghanistan, subject to debate for how people wanted to position themselves. Interestingly enough, in Afghan current law, the current government actually created 20 representative seats for, quote, Kuchis, nomads in Afghanistan. The interesting thing is practically anybody who had an ancestor that was once a nomad claimed himself to be a Kuchi, and quite a number of them grabbed parliamentary seats doing that. And all the nomads that were there that represented many different ethnic groups did not consider Kuchi to be a proper representative thing because they were different ethnic groups that often didn't get along with one another. They said, we have nothing in common. We do move, we are nomads, but this is a power grab by the Pashtun nomads who are taking all the seats. So when we look at, I think one of the things we have to realize is it's not just outsiders that play with definitions, insiders do too. And in some cases it's to ward off a pejorative, but in other cases it's to try to raise the status of the group or to get special representation like in parliament, you know, which often doesn't then actually represent the people who are actually moving around. So it's not just sort of outsiders or insiders as if they're clear categories, at least from my own ethnographic experience. The categories are manipulated and debated even by the people who we are labeling that way. And in some ways, I think perhaps we should consider this to be more of a Weberian ideal type, which Weber said actually doesn't represent anything in the real world, but is a useful thing to organize chaos. And I think that's what we use it for, to organize chaos. And the fact that it doesn't represent anything exactly in the real world, it was never really designed to do that.
Corey, do you still want to say something? You had your hand up.
Yeah, I'll just make one really quick comment, and this, I don't want to actually turn the conversation away from what Thomas was just discussing, but it was something that came just before that in regard to language, because there were various reflections on you know, the term nomad and then trying to actually translate that into a different language, what happens, and the complexities of that, and the fact that nothing ever quite fits. And I'm sure anyone who's done ethnographic fieldwork somewhere else has examples of this. And certainly in Turkana, this is similar. And I think one reflection that comes from this is that it's not just that a question of, have we brought in this new term that, you know, are we using and relying on this new term, that doesn't actually fit the context or the situation of what's happening very well. It's also that our languages, and I'm here talking specifically about English, just don't have many words to discuss these kinds of movement. And you know, an example from Turkana is the term there that is usually most brought up in regard to nomadism is awoton or akawot. And it's the term that specifically refers to when an encampment of a cattle camp will break down the houses, pack up the animals, usually pack things onto donkeys, and move to a new area in search of other graze, and then build new structures there. We would maybe say migrate would be the best term, but then migrate is used for so many different things, from, you know, the ideas of migrating for work, migrating across international borders. Yeah, I guess it would just be pointing out that when it comes to these kinds of movement, our language is also just so depleted of the necessary terms to discuss issues in relation to what the term nomadism ends up standing in for. It fills a gap in a way.
I think she's having a few connectivity.
Oh, sorry. No, I didn't hear you. Sorry, I'm having a very unstable internet connection, so I have to shut off my video. I just want to, you know, say that in my own work, I don't really use the word nomad at all. but I mean, mainly because I, digested David Sneath's and Caroline Humphrey's book, The End of Nomadism, when I was a student, and took those arguments quite seriously. And but yet now I'm in Mongolia working, and there's some really serious issues that I mentioned before related to fortress conservation, or huge amounts of land grabbing from mining. And when it comes to land rights for people who move, sometimes when talking with other experts like mining company management about how to understand the land tenure for people that move, I can use the word mobile pastoralist land rights, but it's also quite difficult to figure out how to describe this to an audience who might be making critical decisions around resettlement and livelihood restoration, which often doesn't happen. There's some interesting information in the chat coming through this. Maria mentioned this idea of strategic essentialism that indigenous peoples use quite a bit to fight for rights. So I'm just wondering, if there's something there. And the question over, is the academic use of nomad appropriate? I mean, in a way, for people like me who work with herders, who work in solidarity with herders, in some ways that line between academic and non-academic is quite fuzzy, and there needs to be some way to work across those groups.
Marco?
Yes, I was thinking about, the reflections of before were inspiring some reflection also on my case study, because and you were talking about this, the relationship between the emic and the ethic, okay, categorization, and how Corey was talking about the gap, no? And I was thinking a lot about, for example, my case study, where in Italy, for example, when you talk about nomads, it is in the collective imagery, but also in the language of the state. Nomads are the so-called gypsies or Roma. No pastoral nomads, nothing like that. Even if there are also pastoral nomads in Italy, but the nomads, as a prototypical category, the central members of this category are the gypsies. Okay. And building on this idea, then there have been a lot of policies concerning the nomads, okay? Then there are the so-called nomad camps that probably you know about what these are, which are basically ethnic ghettos for the Roma, who are categorized as nomads. So I was thinking that when it is up to the Roma that I know, they are using continuously the term nomads, and they use it in the interaction with the non-Roma, with the Gage. Okay, and they say when the first I was talking to them, they were saying, yeah, I mean, you can say Rom, you can say nomad, you can say Zingaro, gypsy. It's the same. Okay, we nomads are like that, we gypsies are like that, and so on. But then when there was the internal usage of the term, the Roma that I know, they would never consider themselves and use the term nomad in the interaction between each other. They would use other terms. And when they were talking about mobility or lifestyle, which is connected to mobility, we use the term çergar. Çergar comes from the Turkish çerge, so it means a tent. It's like the corporal in Romania. So there is this category that talks about mobility. Okay, to be a çergar means to be a Rom who lives in tents, and this means just moving around also. What is interesting is that the çergar category is a category that is usually demeaning, also among the Roma. Okay, so çergar means that you are not only moving, but you lack culture, you lack hygiene, you lack parental ability, and this imagery about the çergar is widespread not only among the Roma, but also the non-Roma in the Balkans. But then there are people that are Roma who, so they don't consider themselves as çergar. But then there are others who consider themselves çergar, and they make a twist in the connotation, and they say, we are çergar, we are moving around, and by doing this, we are not being closed into the nomad camps that are the materialization of the discourse of power towards the Roma. So we have a really twist of the use of the same category. And what I think is interesting is that these categories, Shergar, nomad, and so on, they don't fit. Now there is this gap that we were talking about, and probably this in this equivocality that we might find very interesting points to reflect on. In the non-coincidence, in the gap that there is between this, that then brings the question of usages of the categories and the interstices between them.
Hi. So it feeds into what Marco was saying, but also building on what Ariel was saying. So in the UK at the moment, the government are bringing in more extreme criminalization of like traveling modes of living or mobile modes of living, bringing in new laws about trespass. So it'll be illegal for one vehicle to be on land, like public land or any private land, and that vehicle could be seized immediately and the person arrested and all their belongings taken. So the traveller and gypsy NGOs, which are made up, so this kind of smudges what, as we were talking about earlier, smudges the boundaries between, you know, development kind of workers and members of the community, because these are kind of both the same within some of these NGOs, or most of these NGOs, more so than some than others, are actually using nomadism as a kind of cultural aspect of these groups' modes of living, to be able to that's the main basis that they're challenging this law on. So in that sense, if we're talking about if it's a useful category or how it's being used, yeah, because there's there's travellers in these NGOs, they are using it. So I suppose they're calling them, if not calling themselves nomads, saying that nomadism rather than mobility, because I suppose it suggests this kind of cultural aspect. So yeah, that feeds into what we're saying.
Sorry, I'm afraid I'm making a bit of a fool of myself, because my reaction is only hand clapping or thumbs up, and it disappears after about 5 seconds. So I was just kind of playing with that. I wanted to, I don't want to ignore what Freya is saying, because I think that we've got about 4 gypsy caravans just down the road from us here. And I find it really hard to stop myself from not just stopping the car, pulling over and talking to them. I'm just so glad that they found the Verges there. A fascinating group. But I wanted to really just comment more on, I think Marco and Ariel were coming close to that. You know, sorry, we always have to refer to the area that we work in, but I just want to go back to the Middle East a minute, where if we look at the emek, there is no the only category for nomad in Arabic refers to the gypsies, the Roma, I mean, the last 20, 30 years, they don't like to be called Rajar or Nawar. They actually call themselves Rom or Dom, etc. So but the distinction that is made between the Bedouin, the pastoral herders, sheep, goat, camel, and the nomads, is they will say, well, with nomads, you never know where they're going to be next, because they don't have any ties. But with the Bedouin, you can always predict where they're going to be, or you can find them easily, because there's always a link, there's some kinship, or there's a tie to the land that is associated with the Bedouin that isn't there for the Roma. And when you go down to this tie for the land, this is actually now becomes very problematic, because there is a recognition of the Bedouin having a common use rights to areas of the semi-arid or the steppe lands that are remembered, but that the government current governments are very keen to deny because of the significance of the extractive industries. I mean, mainly it's oil in this region. And these modern agencies like to use the word nomad in the European sense. And what they always say is, these are empty lands. You know, this is tabula rasa. These are people who only come here because they see us and they want to beg for water, or they want to beg for feed. There's a Western, or, you know, what I'm going to call this is a Western perception that, and again, it's about power, that completely ignores the emek categories of land, people relationships. I mean, I'm not going to say that it's ownership as much. It's the recognition of their right to use, and it's recognized by the tribes amongst themselves, and it moves depending upon where there might be a lack of rainfall or droughts. And this is still negotiated, but totally dismissed and not recognized by governments. And I think this is, it's very interesting how, just summing up, Bedouin themselves, the people themselves in the region only see the Roma as the nomad, but this, the way in which we are tied into the neoliberal economies that need access to minerals, et cetera, and conservation is the same. I mean, that's another issue altogether, with very similar problems and difficulties. So I just wanted to carry on with that theme. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm wondering, I think we've got a couple more questions, but I think that it would be good to ask the audience whether or not they had any questions, just because we've got 15 minutes left. And I think we've covered most of the questions and most of the content anyway. So I think that Claire wanted to ask a question.
I would like to say, coming from my background of having studied pastoral nomads for decades, I would like to say how fruitful I think the contribution of traveller gypsy studies has been to our field. And it's really been very rich in my case. And, with the discussions we had with Marco and a lot of you here, and with Judith. So the point, in terms of, I suppose it depends what you want to study, what you find most interesting, what you really, and as to how useful this term is. If you're talking about how people see themselves in Niger, it's not at all useful. But if you're interested in the political dynamics, I think this is where this category has become very interesting. And I like the way you said, Marco, the use of the term nomad as a political weapon. And you can see that very much used in Niger to put people down, and it's a very powerful weapon. But it can also be flipped. It can be provided an opportunity as well. A way of access to grants. I'm thinking of EU grants to traveller gypsies. It's opened up opportunities there. And there are certain, in the Sahel as well, it does open up certain opportunities. I think one thing, there's so much has been mentioned, already covered, but maybe I didn't hear the tourism being referred to, and I think that's an area as well which can provide opportunities. The image of the nomad, and some people are able to use that to advantage. And maybe I'd just like to end on something which has struck me very much, which I mentioned in the earlier session with Greta and Julia organized. But it's something that has happened in Oxford recently in connection with the Black Power movement and the Roads Must Fall movement. And the Pitt Rivers Museum that's been described as the most violent space in Oxford. I occasionally volunteer there, so I've been following, especially the repatriation of objects to where they were looted from. And one set of objects was being returned by the Pitt Rivers is some objects, some Maasai and Samburu objects. And that was the subject of a huge sort of ceremonial handing over of these objects. And we saw a film of it. I didn't attend, but these, they'd got these Maasai from Kenya that were dressed up to the nines with, all their robes and beads and everything. And, you know, I thought, my gosh, you know, tomorrow these people will be dressed up in suits or they will be office workers or something. But here, you know, they're acting the nomad. And in some ways, you know, there are two sides to it. You know, they're playing the part, but maybe there's they're getting status and some opportunities from this interaction. So I just leave you with that image that's very much a current one here in Oxford anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. The playing the part is quite widespread. I'm in Cape Town, for those who don't know. This is where roads began to fall.
That's where he grew up.
Well, he didn't grow up here. He grew up as an adult, and he developed his estate here. But really, what I want to say is around. I mean, you've been talking a lot about the challenges raised by state, other top-down institutions using the category label, whether it's nomad or something else, and you've told us all about local words and others, but it's all as a political weapon, as we were told. We've also talked about examples where the category label is used by those people at various levels, broken up to as a means to resist those state exercises of power. And my question is, what are the on-the-ground consequences of that kind of mutual essentialization? And particularly, and Deleuze and Guattari aside, what are the potential long-term consequences of a strategic essentialist use of the category from below, as it were?
Okay. So who would like to go first? Marco?
Thank you. And I think this is a very interesting question, and it brings a lot of meat on the grill, I think. And I mean, I by myself, but probably have been too much influenced and affected by the Roma that I have been sharing a lot of time, or more than 2 decades now with them. And I am kind of very skeptical usually about the political uses of certain categories and this strategic essentialism at the institutional level. And I think that probably the failures, basically, of the decade of the Roma inclusion that was supposed to lift the condition of the Roma in all Europe in the last, that was a decade from 2005 to 2015, shows how limited also is the possibility to work with the strategic essentialism. Claire was also saying, you know, this person who were dressing, as basically accepting a certain stereotype and incorporating it. Was it a sign of resistance or of introjection of the discourse of power on themselves? And I think this ambiguity will be always there. And I don't know, sometimes, at least for the point of view of the Roma that I know, who despise politics, even among the Roma themselves, which is something which is very peculiar also in among the Roma groups. So in terms of politics, I don't know, I am quite skeptical, and I think that though this can in other contexts be very interesting and it can be also profitable, I don't know how much it is going to be in the European context. And I think that sometimes we as academics, we are giving too much weight and too much visibility to this kind of agency, while instead there are other forms. I know that it has been. I'm aware of the pitfalls of this idea, but the concept of infrapolitics from Scott, I think, should be put a little bit forward, and I was saying, for example, that it is not much, it is the concept of the Certeau of everyday life. The fact that he says that in the everyday life, the language of power is challenged not in a clash, but through another use of it. And I think that in the everyday usages of categories or the concept of nomadism are those who have the most, how can I say, are those who can maybe be the most subversive forms of political actions, which are not institutional but extra-institutional, and they can really break up something. And here, anthropologists, I think, are very important, and that because we need to decolonize also our anthropological thought by bringing giving sense and to the theory of the everyday practices of the person that we are studying, and giving them the same amount of credibility and legitimacy that our own theoretical ideas. And here I just refer to the post-structuralism claim about that, of the otherwise, by Povinelli, for example.
Okay, David?
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I can't really answer with respect to the broader question, but I think Andrew's question is a really excellent one. I mean, you know, buying into the essentialism can be very good for people, groups of people, individuals, and so on. But what is the longer term effect of that? Well, it seems to me likely to reinforce the essentialism and loosely to further enhance what Brubaker calls groupist thought. That is, trying to conceive of the world is a very old, very well established, horribly powerful form of thought, but it conceives of the world in terms of groups of people, races or peoples or ethnicities or whatever it is. And these are the units that then the kind of overview and those interested in playing power politics have to move on their chessboards. And many people buy into that from top to bottom and continue to sort of categorize and treat a person as a representative of some broader group category, which happens to be current. Now, I can't speak in general terms, but in terms of Mongolia, you don't really see that. It's very complicated on the Mongolian side of the border, but on Chinese side of the border, it's a bit more comparable. And I think the answer there is that it was a two-edged sword. The local elites, that is the Mongolian elites, did to some extent buy into the current, at that time, is in sort of 40s and 50s, the current stereotypical view, the essentialist sort of descriptions of Mongols as pastoralists, as a pastoral people. And that could benefit them in some periods they could make good use of that, because by being pastoral people, they could get special treatment, they could get sort of additional terms, additional advantages, rights to land, particular pasture land and so on. But and sometimes it went against them. And more recently, the last sort of 20 years or so, the process that's been described as kind of the touristification, as it were, of China, whereby ethnic branding has become a major feature of Chinese state capitalism, so that every locality is supposed to generate a local brand to compete in the marketplace, both as tourists, but also for consumer products that can then be branded as sort of local Mongol tea, not just tea, but Mongol tea or whatever it is. And this now is actually, the motor is now finally biting the old elite, who used to have their positions reinforced by the notion that they spoke for, because they were a member of this category, this Mongol category, Shaoshu Minzu, the minority nationality. Because this is a separate people, therefore it needs leaders who are of that people. And that was very good for the local elites. But now they've got to a stage where, because it's a brand, you just need effective marketing. And so the depoliticization of this ethnicization and essentialization means that now you really don't need local cadres. As long as the brand does well, the people can, for example, be from Han Chinese speaking backgrounds and can dress up in the Mongol costumes and operate the tourist facilities. And many of them are, much to the outrage of local people from Mongol speaking backgrounds. So I think to try to answer Andrew's brilliant question in the case that I do know a little bit about, I think it's a really understandable strategy, but one that can create hostages to fortune in the future.
There we go. For the question of nomadism, I'm struggling with, well, again, South African history, and the categories there are agriculturalist, sedentary peoples, on the one hand, supposedly speaking Bantu languages, the Bushmen, supposedly hunter-gatherers, and the Khoi who were pastoralists. But my reading of much of this material is that more or less everyone was moving around. Some were more or less settled. They were all relatively small groups. All of these languages are mixed with each other. So there is nothing, and genetically, recent genetic study shows that everybody's mixed. So there really is no evidence, also, no direct evidence for agriculture for the pre-colonial period. It really comes in with colonial mills and maize in particular. So two questions then. How would you propose that I deal with this? Some people rejecting the category of nomadism, some people saying, well, it serves its purpose. Certainly some people in South Africa, as Muggsy has just said, buy into these categories and use them, quite effectively politically. So I'm not quite sure how to write about how I see the thing, since it really flies in the face of most archaeology and historical interpretations. Secondly, do any of you work with the idea of networks, especially Bruno Latour's ideas having to do with networks? He says, for instance, in reassembling society, there are no groups, there's only group formation. And I've been quite fascinated with the idea of networks, or Ingold calls them meshworks, but the idea of relationships rather than categories. Or I sort of think of it as strings versus boxes. So, is anybody thinking in those terms?
Anyone like to jump in on this?
Can I just say I really like the network point there, and I don't want to say more, but I quite agree with you. I think that is a kind of really promising direction.
Yeah, my sense is that, from listening to you and what I've read, and my life experience as an ethnographer and whatnot, these are not categories, but continuums. So some people, even in pastoral societies, are pretty stable. Some people don't move around much, others do, sometimes in the same family, in the same unit. And many agriculturalists, as they encounter flooding or droughts or whatnot, that they move around as well. There's nomadic agriculture. Some people call it, well, slash and burn, or that kind of transhumant idea. But nomadism, I've really enjoyed this panel extremely, because I've recently read bits of Deleuze and Guattari, and found it very, very confusing and complete fantasy. So I don't. Does anybody else have any other ideas about how do I treat South African prehistory with everybody moving around, which is basically what I want to say. The archaeologists and historians say, no, no. And then the strings and boxes, relationships as opposed to categories.
We are out of time, but I think what.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. Well, I think that his question warrants a response. So, Corey, you had your hand up. Go for it. Go for it. I mean, I could go on here all day, but the conference will kill us.
I just had one quick thing that I wanted to say. It doesn't really respond to the issue of strings and networks, but in regard to the labels, and what do we mean when we're trying to talk about nomadism, and how should we apply these terms, whether it's the idea of nomadism or as a label that we would apply to individuals and groups, the nomads. I've not found that very useful, but I found that whenever we're starting to talk, or we feel compelled to maybe turn to those terms, there's something else that points to in the other direction, which is the idea of sedentism. So in a sense, maybe there's something, all of these groups that we're trying to define and try to figure out, are these nomads, are these a certain type of nomad? Often there is something that's held in, that's shared, and it has to do with an antagonism that something is that is actually very mainstream and that isn't spoken about very, very much. And I even hear in regard to, I mean, I've heard multiple people bring up Roads Must Fall. And a big part of that was actually addressing the epistemic violence, the sort of implicit things that are part of mainstream knowledge that result in the othering of various groups of people. And I think that is sort of something to be said for the relationship between this idea of sedentism, which is actually quite hard to define because it's so inherent to everything that we do and the ways that we think. And that's what leads us to look for these ways of othering people and describing something that is different as nomadic. So I sort of come back to the idea of sedentism, which I know Thomas had brought up, the sedentist bias as well whenever he spoke.
Anybody else? Anybody else? Anybody else? Would anyone else like to say anything in relation to the round table, the questions, anything before we wrap up? Livia.
Hello, can you hear me well? Is it okay? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I just thought that it could be also good to add to the thought about the category of nomadism, also how this category is transmitted through translation, because we deal mainly in English with this term, and we could also discuss the immigrant perspective of specific pastoralist groups. But I just would like to also add, if we talk in the Czech language, let's say about the nomadic people, it could mean something different for people. And my second point is also the discussion to the Roma people in Eastern or Central Europe. A lot of Roma people were settled people. So it doesn't have to be always the same when we talk about some specific ethnic group, that it could connotate the same meaning of moving of people. Although, let's say in literature, or it could be different, I mean, in popular literature, and all these images could shape also the understanding. So it was just my point to the discussion. Thank you.
Anyone like to respond to that quickly before we take a question from Claire? Marco?
No, definitely. I think this is a this is a very important point. I think probably, yeah, it will have been also raised by the other intervention, the question that often people who are categorized as nomadic are not nomadic at all, or don't consider themselves as nomadic. And in case of the Roma, this is especially true because most of the Roma have been sedentary for centuries. For sedentarization, but not only that, it is also a choice, and there is so definitely this is also another very interesting aspect, how much then some categories have the power to homogenize a specific group of people on the alleged idea that they are all nomadic. And definitely that is something that we as anthropologists, or in any case social scientists, we must always take into account. I mean, these generalizations can be also extremely dangerous sometimes, no?
Claire? Unmute your microphone, Claire. If you unmute your microphone, if you unmute yourself, it's not working. Try it.
Yeah, okay. Just a very quick comment on this category of nomad in terms of heritage, in terms of memory, in terms of the past, in terms of representations of the past, in terms of how that can be important for people in terms of defining themselves. I think that is becoming perhaps more important, and also in terms of accessing grants, you know, the UNESCO intangible list, or all of that kind of thing. So maybe that's, you know, I haven't found this term very useful in the past, but maybe it's becoming a bit more useful, and that's one of the ways in which it's becoming quite useful at the moment. Heritage. Thank you.
Okay, so I mean, we've run out of time now, so thinking about all of the responses, questions, everything, the content and material of this round table, I think that we could say, as a coda, the myth, figure, and category of the nomad continues to be deployed in social imaginaries, state discourses, and other political and historically officious ways. This means that while the concept contains all the problems discussed in this round table, it appears that it does remain to be analytically tenable. So we've run out of time now, and I'd like to thank everyone for their participation, their question, audiences, everything. It was great. I would go on for another hour if I could. And hopefully this discussion will provide future fruit for thought on this enduring topic. Thank you very much.